They discovered human remains buried beneath the kitchen floorboards. The local physician refused to step foot inside again. When the minister noticed the engravings on the grave markers behind the property, names identical to both the mother and the wife, he fled and was never heard from again. The events that unfolded on that hillside in 1892 were so disturbing, so profane, that official county documents were secretly altered. Yet one birth record escaped destruction, bearing just a single identifier, his name. Hey there! Before we dive in, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment telling us your location and what time you're tuning in. This helps YouTube recommend more stories like this directly to you. Certain regions across this nation harbor bloodlines that flow like streams, confined, serpentine, never straying far from their source. Western Appalachia exemplifies this pattern. Cut off by rugged peaks and crushing destitution, communities remain stationary for generations. Yet Jacob Elbridge's tale doesn't stem from hardship. It originates from fixation. Jacob entered the world during the winter months of 1869 inside a remote cabin nestled within the Blue Ridge. His father's identity was never recorded. His mother, Sarah Elbridge, had reached 31 years, remaining unwed, withdrawn, and recognized by townsfolk solely as that peculiar woman with the childlike voice. She seldom descended from the ridge. During her infrequent visits, residents murmured about her unsettling gaze that held too long, and how she consistently purchased provisions for two, one portion for herself and another supposedly for the son nobody had encountered. But he existed, and beyond that, he was being cultivated. Locals would eventually report anonymously that they detected ritualistic sounds echoing from the mountains after dark, occasionally mirth, occasionally weeping. The most disturbing observation was that the laughter consistently emerged from two distinct sources merging together, identical in tone, one masculine, one feminine, as though someone were copying another or training someone to replicate them flawlessly. Jacob wasn't nurtured like a youngster. He was cultivated like a companion, a reflection, a continuation. When he reached 15 years, he stood 6 feet high, colorless as chalk, and never ventured into town. Sarah did, however, and she carried with her a band, diminutive, handcrafted, whittled from the timber of the very forest surrounding their secluded dwelling. The engraving upon it, currently housed in a regional museum, stated, "To my life, from your birth." Not a token from a mother, but a pledge from a spouse. The 1890 population count identifies Jacob Elbridge as primary resident, age 21. Yet here the documentation splinters. No spouse is documented, no siblings, no lodgers, only him. And one additional woman designated simply as S. Elbridge, age 52. Connection unspecified. Not mother, not wife, merely an entity. That same year, land surveyors observed that the Elbridge territory had expanded. For adjacent households had transferred their plots within months of each other, all for substantially below fair price. All departed without warning. Some suggest they were forced away by intimidation or by something more sinister. They abandoned livestock, equipment, even their ancestral Bibles. It appeared they needed to escape urgently, as though circumstances had shifted. And circumstances had, because that marked the year Jacob and Sarah commenced constructing what locals would call the house with no rooms. It wasn't a conventional dwelling. It was a maze, 7 buildings linked by tight, twisting passages with mirrors positioned in bizarre locations and windows sealed from within. The postal worker declined to approach beyond the entrance. He insisted the surrounding forest wasn't natural, too much leaning inward as though gravitating towards something at its core. Residents started naming the place the Womb. Jacob began appearing, pacing the town's perimeter in his dark coat, perpetually barefoot, perpetually mute. Young ones claimed he watched too intensely, that he never blinked, that he carried the scent of fragrance, specifically her fragrance. By autumn of that identical year, Sarah ceased appearing altogether, yet Jacob started mentioning someone repeatedly as my beloved. In discussions, in correspondence, even in an unusual diary discovered years afterward in the ruins of their homestead, he documented her as though she existed in multiple states, living and deceased, a spouse and a mother, a deity and a phantom. One passage stated, "She precedes me and dwells within me. Her contact purifies me. Her identity is my identity." He authenticated it, not as Jacob, but as Elbridge. Given name excluded, only the lineage. In 1892, a community doctor named Walter Griggs received a summons to the Elbridge estate. Nobody knows who dispatched the message, only that it was composed in immaculate script, inscribed with a dark rust-brown fluid, and secured with wax impressed by what resembled a human tooth. Dr. Griggs felt reluctant yet intrigued. He'd maintained skepticism toward the rumors, rejecting them as primitive speculation, but what he encountered that evening would torment him until his final days. His documentation, uncovered following his death and currently secured in a university collection, remains brief yet horrifying. He chronicled an upstairs chamber filled with figures constructed from animal remains and dried plant husks, each bearing identical features, Sarah's. He detailed confined corridors decorated with paintings all depicting the same pair but aged to display their appearances at various life stages. In one the woman seems adolescent, the boy an infant. In another, she appears mature and he a grown man, yet in a concluding portrait they're presented as husband and wife, standing clasped together, with matching eyes and lips sealed with stitching. Yet what he discovered underneath the structure destroyed him. A storage cellar had been enlarged, nearly excavated, into the ground. What started as a pantry descended into a corridor of compressed soil and charred timbers. At its terminus, a makeshift shrine, and at the center, a bed. Resting upon it, the skeletal form of a woman draped in lace, her fingers arranged over a dried arrangement. Above her, scrawled crudely in what Griggs suspected was coagulated blood, the phrase, "The bride returns when the sun is ready." Griggs escaped without collecting additional observations. He never revisited, never discussed it openly, and when questioned, maintained he had witnessed a union blessed by neither heaven nor humanity. What the community didn't realize was that when he entered that structure, Sarah Elbridge had been deceased for more than 12 months. Yet Jacob never interred her. Rather, he maintained her. Sustained her, secured her remains in a consecrated chamber underground, and persisted in referencing her through writing and speech as both his mother and his partner. By the late 1890s, Jacob Elbridge had transformed from man into legend. Tales proliferated throughout the territory, murmurs of ritualistic sounds penetrating the forest, observations of a pallid figure walking circular patterns at twilight, and the unwavering conviction that the Elbridge bloodline had transgressed some universal principle. Yet something transformed in 1898. A blaze. Nobody understands how it ignited, yet it advanced rapidly. Too rapidly for the regional earth, which was characteristically saturated in summer. When neighbors responded, the structure had vanished. Or more accurately, it had caved inward. The womb, as it was sarcastically designated, had become a tomb. What they uncovered in the wreckage astonished even the most doubtful. 3 remains. The first was readily recognized as Jacob. His vertebrae severely contorted, limbs folded over his torso, teeth ground down to jagged edges. Encircling his throat was a decaying strand of woven hair. Sarah's hair. The second was Sarah herself, still positioned identically on the shrine bed underneath the structure. Her flesh had been processed with some type of preservative, her eyes concealed with tiny pale pebbles. One hand lay upon a Bible, the other grasped a strand of Jacob's hair. Yet the third body, scorched, distorted, smaller, was unexplained. It seemed to be a youth, yet with mature dimensions. Its face was drastically disfigured, as though the skeletal framework had crumbled upon itself, and its digits, 6 on each hand. No documentation existed of another individual residing there. No woman had been observed entering the grounds, yet what disturbed the medical examiner most wasn't the additional fingers or the abnormalities. It was the mandible. The third body's jawbone corresponded to Jacob's nearly identically. Not merely genetically, but architecturally, irregularities in the molars, the identical misaligned incisor, even a break from youth that had mended incorrectly. The probability was infinitesimal. The suggestion was unthinkable. Jacob had conceived a child with his mother, and the child had existed and perished, possibly in that inferno. Some residents assert Jacob ignited the structure himself, either from remorse or from the conviction that only flames could liberate them from what they had evolved into. Others suspect it was the community, that someone or something desired the Elbridge name obliterated. Yet it failed because months afterward a fresh name surfaced in the congregation registry. E. Jacobson, age 7, orphan, adopted. The designation E. Jacobson appeared harmless enough, merely another orphan in a community that preferred avoiding inquiries. He was received by Reverend Clean, a man recognized for his compassion and tragic fortune with children. His spouse had perished during delivery, and his own boy had drowned years earlier. Residents believed the Reverend perceived this new youth as redemption. Yet peculiar occurrences commenced almost instantly. E. Jacobson declined to rest inside. He demanded to construct a tiny shelter behind the congregation building fashioned from branches, roots, and abandoned fabric. When interrogated, he claimed the church barriers suffocated the voices. When asked which voices, he'd respond plainly, the ones that sing her name. He never referenced his parents, never questioned where they went, yet he did carve a tiny wooden object, a band identical to the one Sarah Elbridge had presented Jacob decades before, and he wore it perpetually. Reverend Clean began maintaining a diary cataloging the child's conduct. Initially, it was subtle, bizarre illustrations, nocturnal wandering, reciting expressions in an unrecognizable tongue, yet by winter the recordings became desperate. He doesn't age, Clean documented. His face alters slightly. I swear he grins like an elder. Sometimes I detect two voices when he talks, one elevated, one deep. He continues addressing me as father, yet with an inflection that freezes me, as though I am inferior to him, as though I am the child. One evening, during an especially fierce storm, Clean awakened to discover E. Jacobson hovering over his bed, drenched, grinning. In his grasp, a charred fragment of paper with smudged ink. The only decipherable words, "The bride returns when the sun is ready." That marked the final evening E. Jacobson was observed publicly. Clean's residence burned completely 3 days afterward. His remains were discovered in the cellar, arranged precisely like Sarah Elbridge had been, eyes concealed, hands arranged, mouth stitched closed. The youth had disappeared. No tracks, no observers, merely one concluding diary passage scratched into the barrier of the shelter behind the congregation building. She came back, not as before, but as fire, and she took me in her arms. If you're still here, you possess more courage than most. Share in the comments, what would you have done if this was your ancestry? Decades elapsed. The Elbridge designation faded from recollection intentionally. Residents commenced referring to that ridge as the burned place, a designation their offspring learned not to question about, and the congregation documents where E. Jacobson had been inscribed were inexplicably destroyed in a flood in 1911. Yet trauma, even when concealed, possesses a method of flourishing underground. In 1934, a government surveyor named Lewis Penn was dispatched to catalog historical land titles for a rural electrification initiative. He was meticulous, compulsive even. He intended to chart everything, every stone barrier, every collapsed fence. And that's how he located it. At the summit of a ridge, extensively overgrown, was a well. At least that's what he assumed until he extracted the decomposed timber covering it and discovered stairs instead. Spiral, carved from stone, descending into absolute darkness. Penn was not a superstitious individual. He transported a flashlight, rope, and a revolver. He descended alone. His personal field observations, later retrieved from his abandoned vehicle, portray a winding descent into what he termed a room that feels older than the land around it. It was circular, with barriers covered in mirrors, each fractured down the middle, yet positioned to reflect each other infinitely. In the middle sat a wooden chair, small and child-sized, and on the barriers painted in faded crimson, again the expression, "The bride returns when the sun is ready." Beside the chair lay a ring. Penn retrieved it, described it thoroughly, wooden, carved, identical to the one from the Elbridge collections. Yet what troubled him was the designation burned into the interior. E. Jacobson. He attempted to depart, yet something pursued him. That's what he documented in the margins of the observations in progressively frantic penmanship. It knows my name. It's watching through the mirrors. She's here. Then silence. His flashlight was subsequently retrieved, located in the wilderness 5 miles from the ridge, batteries functional. His revolver was uncovered in a stream, corroded yet loaded. Pen was never observed again. To this day, residents refuse to traverse that ridge. Hunters claim the birds won't soar over it. And some claim that on motionless evenings, if you stand quietly, you'll detect something reverberating from beneath the ground. 2 voices, one masculine, one feminine, singing the identical name. There exist families in American history whose transgressions are preserved in judicial documents, press clippings, and mortality certificates. Yet the Elbridges are not among them. Their tale exists in murmurs, in charred diaries, and in the concealed shame of a community that attempted to forget. Yet forgetting does not equal erasing. In 1979, a graduate student from the University of Virginia, investigating folklore for his dissertation, encountered the designation Jacob Elbridge in a deteriorated newspaper inserted into a congregation Bible for safekeeping. The article was concise, merely a solitary sentence. J. Elbridge, presumed dead in the fire, 1898. No kin. Yet the student, captivated, investigated further. What he uncovered was a fragmented paper trail, unusual transactions from historical ledgers, land certificates authenticated with only an initial, and numerous missing individual reports filed over an interval of 80 years, all near the identical forested ridge. He attempted to chart them, every incident, every unexplained disappearance, every burned residence. And what materialized chilled him to his foundation. A spiral. The core of which was the historical Elbridge estate. His investigation was never released. His professor rejected it as hysteria masquerading as anthropology. Yet the student's observations, later located by his roommate, disclosed something else, illustrations, numerous of them, each depicting a woman in a wedding veil, no eyes, merely hollow cavities filled with hair, and a boy beside her, maturing in each image, until ultimately, in the concluding sketch, they were identical. A man and woman, hand in hand, with mouths sewn closed and a band on each finger. One concluding observation sat at the base of the folder, handwritten and seemingly scrawled in panic. The line never broke. The blood runs backward. She marries what she births and he births what he marries. In 1981, the student vanished on a hiking expedition near the identical ridge. His remains were never retrieved. Only his camera was located, its concluding photograph displaying a shadowed figure in a white dress partially concealed behind a twisted tree. Some claim it was a hoax. Others claim it was her. Yet those who've resided long in that territory, they never speak her designation, never walk the ridge, and never wear bands carved from timber. Because the Elbridge legacy isn't a family tree. It's a circle, unbroken, eternal, rotating in silence beneath the roots of America.